Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Heather Hilliard, and I'm a principal at Caliber Leadership Systems. Over our 25 or more years of working closely with executive teams and individual leaders on behavioral change, leadership, and organizational development, combined with all of the work and research we've been doing over the last 10, 12 years on personality styles, neuroscience, and how emotions factor into the driving of behavior, we have come to understand and identify that there are 4 very distinct dysfunctional leadership styles. Each of these styles has its own challenges, as well as its own particular path towards development and behavioral change. Each of those 4 styles also represents a very different negative impact on the organizations in which they lead, impacts that can often lead to dysfunction within the organization or even just a failure to achieve the true potential of the organization. In this webinar, our second in our series on dysfunctional leaders, we are focusing on the successful but hands-off avoidant leader. So over the course of the session today, what we're going to cover off are the different characteristics of this particular leadership style. So what is this all about? How does the avoidant leader style work? We'll also be covering off the cost of implications the cost implications for organizations of these avoidant leaders. We will give you the top 4 signs that you can tell that you are, in fact, working with an avoidant leader. And then, of course, just to help out, we'll provide you with some key tips on how to survive your experience working for an avoidant leader. Finally, we'll finish off with some very specific tips on how you change the behavior of an avoidant leader, because it is possible to change their behavior, and there's often obviously the need to do so given the cost implications of this behavioral style in organizations. It is our hope that by the end of this webinar on avoidant leaders, you will be able to identify them by their behavior and impact, know how to deal with them personally to minimize their impact on you and on the organization, and really look at understanding what it's going to take to bring about change in the behavior. The reality is that avoidant leaders bring great strengths to our organizations. So shifting them out of their dysfunctional behavioral patterns is really the key to getting more from these particular leaders. So if we look at the characteristics of the avoidant leader, really what they are individuals that are highly, highly focused on productivity and the needs of the business. So they're a very self-directed, highly functional, and independent group of leaders. They know what they want to achieve, and they do extremely well when working on their own, and particularly when they have a lot of autonomy and authority in terms of the work that they're doing. We find them very often in senior roles in organizations or as successful entrepreneurs. As entrepreneurs, they thrive during the first stages of the business where there is the need for that hands-off leadership style, in that there's an element of chaos and excitement that goes along with it. They have great skills at designing products, doing business development, negotiating deals, or driving sales. Avoidant leaders, though, delegate responsibility and authority to their subordinates. So they make people feel like they're capable of doing much more than they actually are able to do. Now, this is a really strong motivator for the right kind of employee who wants the opportunity to prove themselves, because they really do give people the autonomy that they need to succeed without guidance and feedback to ensure they do. However, avoidant leaders actually have a lot of difficulty when it comes to expecting things from people and engaging in productive performance dialogue with their direct reports. So really what we see with this leadership style is they just don't get involved with their employees. So really the dysfunctional avoidant leadership style is characterized by a pattern of behaviors that keep them focused on achieving their goals with minimal involvement with others. So it's kind of, we talk about it like they're kind of ships passing in the night or planets moving in slightly different orbits. They're all in this together, but if you look at the pattern of the avoidant leader, it's like they're there but they're not, and they come in and they go out, but really it feels like they don't really land and really get involved in what's going on with their staff. Given that they're such independent people, they really want to be left alone to do their own thing. They want to focus on what it is that they love to do and what it is that gives them energy. And so it's hard to pull them down into the business and actually get them to lead the business or the area of the business that they're responsible for. They're afraid that if they get too far into the business, that they'll actually get bogged down unnecessarily and get too far into the details or the weeds. So really the focus for them is on having the freedom to achieve their goals and to work out their potential the way they see fit, and having people do the same thing. So as a result, what we see is a real tendency of the avoidant leader to avoid making decisions. So they will deflect decision making, they will have conversation expecting others to make the decisions, but they really won't come in and take a position and actually make a finite decision for the organization or for their team. And equally along that same line is that they're not providing their employees with a really clear sense of expectation. So underlying this leadership behavioral pattern, different from the other three, is a person who really keeps themselves emotionally isolated. And the reason for that is a fear of being hurt, rejected, or devalued. And that's an important aspect to understand about the avoidant leader, is what is it emotionally that is driving this defensive behaviors or the self-protective behaviors to come into play in the organization. They also have difficulty knowing what it is that they're really entitled to ask of other people, and they have a true fear of being exposed for their inadequacies. So despite their roles in organization, they have great difficulty defining, deciding, asserting themselves, asserting their authority, and because of that, we see them not dealing with issues or conflicts and really failing to motivate or engage the people in it. Now, one of the important things to remember, though, always about the avoidant leader style is that they do have the ability to develop. So while we talk about the different characteristics and what their strengths are and where some of the challenges are from a leadership perspective, these folks are operating under a self-defensive system of behavior, and so therefore it is possible to get in and shift them into a different behavioral set. So before we go into some more details about the avoidant leader, I just want to talk about the costs and implications for organizations, because again, there are a lot of avoidant leaders running organizations and in senior roles in charge of big pieces of organizations or teams that are driving the business. And there are a number of different implications and costs associated with having the pattern of behavior that comes with the avoidant leader. So first and foremost, of course, is that situations involving conflicts take a really long time to get resolved. In one organization that I'm working with, one of the things that I've been working with them for several years now, and there are a fair number of folks on the executive team that demonstrate this particular leadership style. And what we've actually had to move to is having them make up a list of all of the things that they've been talking about for the last 6, 12, 18, 24 months that remain unresolved. Because those are the things, again, a symptom of an avoidant leader driving an organization or avoidant leaders driving the executive team, is they talk about the situations, but because they're a conflict, there actually is no resolution to it. So that conflict stays in the organization and people start adapting or working around that conflict. The other thing we see is that direct reports engage in power struggles. So given that the avoidant leader doesn't step in to direct, to define, to exercise their authority, the direct reports really get to run the show. And so then it becomes about what they want and what they feel like doing, not necessarily what the business needs, which then creates the power struggles given that particular gap. So the other thing that we see as a clear pattern or cost implication for organizations with avoidant leaders is their tendency to keep non-performers on board for years and years and years. They would much rather complain about the inadequacy and the lack of performance of an individual than actually get involved in dealing with and resolving the conflict. So this pattern in particular, this outcome of their behavioral pattern, has a significant cost, because it's not just about the direct impact of that non-performer, not their failure to deliver or their inability to deliver, but it's the impact that it has on the broader team as they feel disengaged or affected by the fact that that non-performer is being worked around and tolerated and their behavior is not being addressed. What we also see is that with the avoidant leader, the energy goes into complaining rather than resolving. And what I mean by that is where, to a degree, the avoidant leader will go around to all of the people that they talk to about things and complain about the person or the people, about what's not being done, but there's no actual resolution to it. It's just simply energy going out there into saying, this isn't working, this isn't working. And equally on that is the complaining then doesn't lead to development. So there's no actual correction in the employees, and that lack of alignment ultimately leads to poor performance. Now, the interesting thing that I find with these leaders is that even though we talk about it in poor performance, the organizations could still be making money. So it's not that they're not financially successful. It's just that the level of performance that they're achieving relative to what may be possible in their marketplace is lower than what we would like to see it be, or lower than what it could be. So those are really the characteristics, the key characteristics and the implications for the organizations. Now, how do you take that and say, well, how do I know? What tells me that my leader is avoidant? So I'm going to highlight the 4 key signs. There are others, but we talk about the 4 kind of key ones or key cues that tell you that you are, in fact, working for an avoidant leader. So first and foremost, what we see with employees working for this particular dysfunctional leadership style is they're always wondering what they're supposed to be doing. They, come and they talk to their leader, but they walk out of the meeting without a really clear sense of, okay, now what? What am I supposed to do and how am I supposed to do it? So employees tend to spend a lot of time trying to figure out if what it is that they're doing is right, because you can't get your boss to give you a direct answer. And so one of the things that we often find in our work with this leadership style is we're always having to do the defining. We're always telling them what it needs to happen and putting that structure in place for them, because they have real difficulty in actually expressing what it is they expect of you and how they want to see it happen. Part of the reason behind this is that avoidant leaders really believe that others should be as self-directed as they are and as self-motivated as they are. So really, as an avoidant leader, if I'm one, I think I know how to direct myself. I don't need direction from others, and so therefore all of my staff should function in that same sort of way. So they really don't take responsibility for the performance of their direct reports, and they don't like to get personally involved with them. Sure, they'll have a relationship with them, but if you actually watch the avoidant leader, it's like you kind of know them, but you don't know them. And again, that orbiting planets, you may touch on them from time to time, but you really don't have the kind of relationship you might have with another leadership style. So what happens then is that it's the avoidant leader, because they feel anxious when they have these personal conversations or when they talk to employees about what's working or what's not working. So because of that anxiety, they move to avoid them. So they'll rationalize that employees actually really should just be able to figure things out themselves. Or for some of our CEOs, clients that have this as their style, we've actually gone so far as to provide them with scripts in terms of what to say when they're having a performance discussion with their employees. And they will still, in that discussion, abandon that script, abandon the message, sugarcoat it, drop it all off, because their need to avoid the conflict is so great. And they rationalize that employees should be able to figure things out for themselves. So what's the impact of this? So really, when we look at all of this lack of direction is that we have a leadership style that is excessively permissive. So employees get to do what they want to do, how they want to do it. They can have projects and never deliver on them, and there will be absolutely no consequences for it. And really, as we look at how the avoidant leader expresses themselves, it's always in the way of metaphors or stories or past experiences that leave employees frustrated and anxious because they're always struggling to figure out what is expected. So this is an organizational environment that where you always feel like you're not quite getting and doing and hitting the mark because the expectations are never really clear. So the next clue is that we talk about around an avoidant leader is you never really feel like you're on solid ground. They're the masters of flip-flop. So they will say yes to whomever is sitting across the room from them, or they will say no depending on the position of that particular person. So really, again, because they don't want to get involved with others and they're conflict avoidant, they will go along with whomever it is that is in there creating that energy with them or talking about what it is that that person thinks. Then they could easily leave the room, talk to someone else, and completely do a flip-flop on their decision. Or they could say yes in that moment because they're saying yes because they don't want to cause any conflict or disruption, and then turn around and really really be meaning no after the fact. So one of the things that employees always experience is they having to double check before they progress on something as to whether or not the decision is a final decision. Is this an interim decision? Is this a temporary decision? For one of my clients who was building up a new team, it was one of the things that we would say to everyone is that when you have the conversation about something new, have the conversation with no expectation for a decision, let the, in this case it was the COO, let him have some time to reflect on it before we come back for the final decision. Because what that did was it eliminated the flip-flopping. Because in that initial presentation of the information, he might say one thing, he'd go away and think about it and come back with a different response. And that was a huge source of frustration for their employees. It's that changing of the mind and people not really understanding. But again, at the bottom or what's underneath this is it's to avoid interpersonal engagement or conflict, really not being able to tolerate negative emotions or others, and not really feeling powerful enough despite their role to actually resolve the issue at hand. So the impact here is that employees lose respect for them. They start to look at their leader as not being effective, of not knowing their own mind, of not being able to make a decision. The other thing that we see happen is that employees start to wait to start things or to get things done. So they have a conversation with their boss and they say, well, if I wait another day or two, they're going to change their mind, so I'm not going to bother to do it. And so we see a lot of not just stopping and starting of things, but even the employees becoming more passive in not really driving things forward because they just figure that eventually the boss is going to change their mind. So lots of confusion that we can see when we're working for this avoidant leader in the organization. This is one of my favorites, is the not being able to get them to make a decision or deal with issues. And this is probably the most frustrating or complained about aspect of this dysfunctional leadership style. The reality is that they find it really, really difficult to be decisive or to know what to do if there's conflict in particularly, either on their teams or just even over a decision that needs to be made. So what ends up happening is they give subordinates the power to make their own decisions and that freedom that I talked about earlier to work in their own way, but by doing this, they really abdicate responsibility for the final outcome. And so you see when we talk about this indecision that they have is they present themselves with absolute clarity about the decision, but there isn't a specific decision that's in mind. So giving an example, I was having a conversation with an executive team that I work with, and we were talking about a decision about a particular employee and what to do with them. And the group we'd had some debate, and so I said, okay, let's get to a decision. So I started with the CEO and I said, okay, what's the decision? And the individual said, you know, absolutely, the person doesn't fit our culture, you know, the behavior's not aligned, we need to deal with it. Pause. But they've been there for a long time, and it was like, so where's the decision, right? So that's what they do. The avoidant leader will give information, will talk about the situation, but trying to find the decision within it is very, very challenging because they're not by nature directive and definitive when they're leading, and they have to work very, very hard at actually making decisions and dealing with issues. So they have to get pushed to that or worked with in order to be able to do that. So in a team situation, what ends up happening is there's a lot more infighting and dysfunction that we would like to see in an organization, right? Because we can't actually get people to make the decision. They can't get the leader to make the decision that they need to make. So team cohesion is probably the biggest impact on this failure to deal with issues and make decisions of the avoidant leader. So finally, the fourth cue is that they don't like to use their position, power, or authority to get things done. So you find with an avoidant leader, and this can be a real clear sign that you are working for one, is that they act more like a colleague than a leader. So the relationship feels more sort of, you know, friend-based as opposed to, again, that directive, that authoritarian, you know, the style that would be used by other leadership styles. So there isn't that same kind of, you know, again, it's not a definition at the core. So they're very flexible and they're very adaptable, and the adapting is in response to the conflict and the emotions of other people. So they say yes when they mean no. They will literally be in the room with an employee who is acting completely inappropriately and not say or do anything about it. They won't say or do anything about it in that moment or even after the fact. They won't correct them because internally the dialogue for them is the employee doing that way, maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. Obviously, they have a reason why they feel like they have to behave like that, so I don't have to get involved with this. This will just work itself out. So really what, again, they're doing is avoiding unpleasant feelings that they feel when they point out to someone that they are wrong or create disappointment by saying no. So the result in an organization is, when you've got leaders who aren't actually acting out of their own authority, who aren't taking charge, who aren't holding people accountable or defining expectations, employees are not engaged, and it really does create a power vacuum where then we see conflict and power struggles. And again, the outcome of power struggles in an organization is silos. It's a lack of collaboration. It's about people moving in different directions. And again, one of the symptoms is we see a lot of complaining, not just at the executive level, but also at the employee level that gets acted out because it doesn't feel like we're all in this together, that the dividing piece that the avoidant leader does. Oh, sorry, one more. Guess I can't count. So the kids are running the candy store, very last one, and along the same lines, really, the avoidant leader is really allowing employees to overstep the boundaries of their position. And if you have an employee who is ambitious and aggressive, they're going to take advantage of that opening. And they're going to move into either privately or publicly moving to take on and lead and drive the organization in that gap that the avoidant leader is creating. Really, again, avoidant leader not wanting to get involved, they just allow people to go along and don't step in to actually resolve the issue. Part of it is that as an avoidant leader, they don't actually recognize when they're being disrespected. Because their first response is to avoid and adapt to whatever's happening and to rationalize it, it doesn't get triggered in them when an employee or a situation is actually undermining to them or disrespectful. And again, so they don't step in, and they also don't recognize the role that they are playing in creating this dysfunction around them. So the element in here is that failure to manage the performance that is characteristic of the avoidant leader is actually causing problems on the team and underperforming employees. But a lot of them don't actually know what they're doing wrong because, again, that absence of communication and information coming from the leader is a big part of the challenge here. So how do you survive it? So if you are working for an avoidant leader, then what do you do? And how do you survive the experience without pulling out your hair in frustration? So while we talk about the characteristics and some of the negative implications in an organization, it's always important to remember that these folks create incredible results. They drive performance in organizations. They shape the future. They shape the products. They're deal makers. So there are, we want them and we need them. The question is how do we survive working with them and to bring out to kind of manage the situation, and then what do we do to develop them? So first and foremost is recognizing that their avoidant behavior is actually a form of self-protection. So everything that we've talked about in terms of the characteristics that we see and the implications that we see, what they do and what they don't do, is really all about keeping the avoidant leader out of harm's way. So that's not how employees interpret their behavior. That's not even how employees react to it. But the reality is what the avoidant leader is trying to do is really protect themselves in these interpersonal interactions that are not within their comfort zone. So some employees will react to the avoidant leader by getting angry and presenting issues in a more emotional or forceful manner. But that doesn't work. The strong emotional reactions are simply going to cause the avoidant leader to withdraw further. And so it's very, very important that if you're working for one is that you're responding to them as opposed to reacting to them, that you're not increasing your aggression or going after them out of your frustration, but you're looking at what's going on and helping them to work it through it. So really being aware of your own feelings about their behavior and figuring out how to approach what's going on with them in a very objective and consistent way. Accepting the limitations of the avoidant leader goes a long way to managing their behavior. So if you stop thinking that they should be different and try and fix them, then we can actually support the effectiveness by looking at other solutions that will allow us to get in and take care of them. One of the things that's important to do is to make the cost of avoidance clear in the minds of the CEO. I remember one of my clients who definitely was an avoidant leader was constantly complaining about the dysfunction and couldn't see his own role in it. And it was very important that we stepped into the shoes of that particular CEO to say what really matters to him. And, for one of the things we tried to connect all of this up to in his behavior in particular was how it was getting in the way of some particular personal goals and ambitions that he had. And helping him to see that and make that connection that what he was doing was actually putting what he wanted to accomplish at risk, it actually helped to move the person along that particular path. So trying to make the downsides of their avoidant behavior evident to them, that may help them to feel an incentive to change. So, for example, you might explain that by not directly addressing underperformance on their team, they're alienating the high performers. If they're tolerating negative behavior from one employee, it may be then creating people from not actually stepping up and doing something different because of what they're seeing. Okay? Always when you're working with the avoidant leader, we want to come at them from the perspective of never ever doing anything to set them up to feel like we're shaming them or that there is something wrong with them. Because again, if I go back to what I said at the beginning of the session was underneath all of this is a level of insecurity and fear that they're not good enough and that there is something in them that isn't allowing them to be as effective as they could be. And so it's very, very important to come to them with the desire to help. If I want to be helpful, how can I help you? Let me make this easier for you. I know you're busy. Let me take care of this. Can I do that for you? As opposed to blaming them or accusing them or attacking them in any way. So, and particularly if we bring it down to very specific issues, consequences, and solutions that we know will work. And that, again, helps them. We offer to be the bridge between them and the rest of the employees. Often with this leadership style, we try and find a 2IC for them who can drive more of the structure and the definition and the cohesion because they themselves aren't going to move towards that particular outcome. Right? So, for example, if their meetings are ineffective, then we actually get the group to agree to a team process and we set one of the other team members to be responsible for the agenda, the outcomes, the action planning, the timing, all of those sorts of things. The other thing is that it's really important when you're working for an avoidant leader is to not hesitate to really talk about what it is that you need. So a lot of employees will give up and withdraw from the avoidant leader if they don't get what they ask for the first time. And this doesn't help anyone because it takes a couple of tries again to get through the defenses of the avoidant leader. We often talk about it when you have an avoidant leader is going in and talking sometimes to them calmly doesn't work. And sometimes you have to jump up and down like there's a fire before you can actually get through into that emotional system of theirs. So don't become an avoider yourself. Don't mimic their behavior or shy away from pointing out your needs or the needs in that particular situation. Don't hesitate to ask them questions or go back to them for more clarity. A lot of people who work for avoidant leaders will make up excuses like saying, oh, well, they're too busy or they're not around or I can never get a hold of them. But really what they're doing is unconsciously reacting to the pattern of the avoidant behavior. So it's really important that you stay in it, that you initiate what you need and you go after it with them. And finally, don't gang up on them. In the case of the avoidant leader, there is not power in numbers. So bringing a bunch of colleagues in, heading in, it may come off as more conspiratorial than in the best interest of the organization. So really what you want to do is come at them in a one-on-one approach. It's much less threatening. Again, it prevents any potential that you may be shaming them in front of others, which we always want to prevent happening with an avoidant leader. Initiate sort of that ongoing one-on-one dialogue so it's a regular thing, taking notes, sending confirmations of what you've agreed and decided on, and really that's the best way to stay connected to the avoidant leader. So really looking at your role is to what do I need to do, how do I need to build that connection with them because I recognize that they're not going to come to me. Should they cancel meetings, show up at their office to reschedule. So don't be swayed by their avoidance tactics or in any way, shape, or form take them personally because we don't want to start acting the same way they are acting because that makes the compounds the situation and makes it worse. So how do we change this? So we're living with this reality. Avoidant leaders are everywhere in organizations. I'm sure by now you've probably put names and faces to the avoidant leaders in your organization. So if you're in the situation where your job is to work to change the behavior of the avoidant leader, What is it that you can do, and how do you go about doing it? So this is one where we come at this from our perspective, looking at it in terms of personality and brain development and the emotional drivers. And each one of the 4 narcissistic leadership styles has a very different path to behavioral change. As I said earlier, changing their behavior is possible, but you have to look at what it is that they need emotionally and developmentally in order to move through it, and not get swayed by their own resistance to getting involved in their own development. Because again, my experience with these folks, their first step is to get me to work with everyone else, and then when that's gone as far as it can, then they might be willing to do some work. But it's recognizing that and appreciating that and saying, we'll do everything we can, but at some point you have to do the next step, the final step that's going to take the organization from here to where you really want it to be. So how do we do that? So avoidant leaders are not the type to be sent off to a leadership course, a workshop. That doesn't help them to change behavior. They really do need to work with a leadership coach. And the reason why we say that is that it helps them actually build tolerance to personal discussions. So going to a workshop with a whole bunch of other people, there's the potential still for anonymity in that. They can check out. They can show up in body, not in mind. They can stay on their email. They can do all sorts of things to really avoid it. But in that one-on-one coaching relationship, what they're doing is actually building tolerance for getting involved and staying involved in that interpersonal dynamic. Now, the coach needs to understand their personality structure, the defenses that they bring to in their role as a leader, and they also have to be able to challenge their idea about what people need without making them feel inferior. So you see the pattern here. We don't do anything with the avoidant leader that's going to make them feel like we're shaming them, making them feel inferior, or anything less than being a strong leader. We're just trying to fine-tune some of the aspects of how they go about leading. They need to be led. At the end of the day, with the avoidant leader, you have to do a lot of telling. You have to tell them what they need to do. You have to tell them how it's going to happen for them, and tell them how you're going to help them and hold their hand and move them along, because they tend to behave as though they have no problems. And again, when you go back to what I was saying earlier about some of the characteristics of them not being definitive, not defining a solution, a plan, a resolution of something, same applies for themselves. So they can know about something that's going on, complain about it, be frustrated about it, but they won't necessarily come to you and say, I'm having this issue, can you help me with it? One of the other places we focus on with avoidant leaders is training them on 2 things. One is assertiveness, so how to be direct, how to deliver messaging, having those difficult conversations, how to really build up that emotional intelligence competency about being able to truly express themselves regardless of the reactions and the impact on other people. And this can go, you can be amazed at how far an avoidant leader will go. There's one of my clients who is refusing to communicate out to the organization that they're undertaking a compensation review, and because they are so afraid of how employees are going to react. But we know, based on the feedback that we've gotten from employees, it's what they want, and the organization making the commitment to do this is going to be a huge win for the organization. But he's so afraid to go out and do what any other CEO might do or any other HR leader might do and say, this is what we're doing, this is the plan, here's what's going to happen, doesn't mean raises, is that they say nothing and they do nothing and they shut down the communication. And so the assertiveness training is really about helping them to find that voice and to use that voice with authority. And the other piece is issue resolution. We can teach these avoidant leaders an actual framework for identifying the issues, identifying how we're going to resolve it, generating options, and moving people through to the very end. Because again, otherwise their tendency is to complain about the issue as opposed to being able to work through with their folks in terms of how do we come up with a resolution process for it. 360-degree feedback is really useful for this particular leadership type, and this helps them to get a better perspective in terms of reality, and gives them a sense of some of those things where the degree to which their behavior is negatively impacting the team or the organization can really be seen and quantified to a degree. So this is part of what will motivate them to shift their behavior, because they do aspire to be seen in a particular light. It is a very supportive approach to development, especially as, depending on how the 360 is structured. But what happens is it really helps to make them aware of the consequences of their actions and leads to some thinking about how else might I handle that situation. One of the interesting things is, of course, if they're CEOs of organizations and we don't have any kind of 360-degree feedback, typically they report into a board, or maybe if they're the entrepreneur, they don't have one, but they're not getting feedback from anyone. And so they may get the occasional comment from a direct report about something that they think that the CEO needs to do, but a lot of boards still to this day don't engage in a rigorous performance review process. And last but not least, we really encourage the use of systems to identify, flag, and work through their avoidant behavior. So some of the places in particular that we're always watching for it is in recruitment, because there's a tendency for them to hire insecure or inexperienced people underneath them who actually need more engagement and hand-holding. And of course, as an avoidant leader, you don't get involved and you don't hand-hold. And so the reality is that if folks are on a steep learning curve reporting into them, it's not going to work, because that employee is not going to get the coaching and the development support that they require. Equally, in the recruitment process, or even in promotional practices, if we're talking about putting people up into the executive ranks against the CEO, is they really need people who are able to manage up, people that are comfortable with stepping into that gap between where the avoidant leader is functioning and what the business actually needs to be successful, or what the team needs to be successful. And not everybody is comfortable with that. And there are many, many employees who believe, even at the executive level, who believe it's the boss's job, not mine, and I'm just going to sit back and wait for them to do that. So our systems, so how we set objectives, how we delegate responsibility across the organization, anything that we have for measuring and holding people accountable, all of those systems can help us work around and support the avoidant leader, because we're managing performance and we're managing people in a different way, but also recognizing the reality of the avoidant leader. It allows these systems also let us know when the avoidant behavior is coming up so that we can bring it back. Regular team meetings, again, structure and definition, not that the leader has created it themselves, but that the group has created and pulls the leader into it, will help the overall success of the organization. So that sort of wraps up the session about this particular leadership style. As I said, they are very, very commonly found in organizations. Like, I always make the joke that probably in Canada we have more than our share of this particular leadership style, given the nature of the Canadian culture as being overall fairly conflict avoidant and risk averse. And so we do find that these folks in organizations really create a bit of a stopping point. I was doing a training session with a client yesterday, and they were talking about this situation where they'd all agreed that they needed to improve something for the customer, or how the information or the flow of something for a customer, and their peer in another area of the organization agreed with that, but then refused to do anything to change the way his department works. And so after several runs at that particular person saying yes but really meaning no, they decided to escalate it up. And so we were laughing about it, because what they've done is they've escalated it up to another avoidant leader who's now sitting on it saying, I'll take it into consideration, with no timeline, no deadline, no sense of when this is going to be resolved. Meantime, the other department that's involved in the customer interface is getting complaints nonstop from the customers. And so this is where it's sort of saying, well, how do we then bring them all back together? Because you got to get them in the room, and you got to go back to that piece of what's the process that we have in our organization for resolving issues, because we have to not let it be people dependent. When we've got that many avoidant leaders, we need to have a process and a system or discipline in our organization that we are continuously using that allows us to move to issue resolution. So with that, we come to the end of this one on avoidant leaders. As we said, there are 4 styles in total. The first one that we did was on the narcissistic leader. Our next webinar coming up in February will be on the paternalistic leadership style, which in itself is also very interesting in terms of what it creates in organizations. The impact of each one of these dysfunctional leadership styles is quite different, and the solution and the path forward in an organization is also quite different. And so thank you very much for participating in the session. I hope you found it useful and informative, and as I said, I hope you've been able to figure out and put names and faces to the folks that are avoidant leaders and have some ideas of how you might work differently with them going forward. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to, again, we've got the Q&A form there if you want to pose any questions. We'll just give it another couple of minutes to leave that open. And thanks again. So while I wait for all of you to pose your questions to me, I will let you know that we will be sending out the link for this recorded webinar in case you would like to pass it along to any of your colleagues. We do also have an article that is available that goes into some more detail about the avoidant leadership style, which is also a very useful read for those leaders who are demonstrating this behavior to start to build their self-awareness. We do offer a tool that helps people understand which of these 4 dysfunctional leadership styles they're most likely to fall into, and to help them figure out their development out of that process. So we, again, without any questions coming through to me right now, we're going to close off the session for today. Oh, wait, we have a question. So any additional thoughts on what I can do to improve my style, because I see myself as an avoidant leader? So thank you for that. I, too, share that with you. I'm an avoidant leader as well. And for us, what it is, it's the same thing that we're looking at is we want to catch ourselves when we're talking ourselves out of doing something for fear of going into the conflict. So where we're not addressing a performance gap, where we're not, being directive with the employees or other people, our peers in the organization. One of the things that I find really helpful, and we always give to our clients as well with this style, is scripting. So if I have to go in and have a conversation with a client or with one of my employees where I know I'm going to have to deal with conflict, I actually prepare a script beforehand. What am I going to say? How am I going to say it? What's the messaging that I want to get across? I run through it a couple of times out loud, because just saying it in my head's not good enough. I have to do it out loud. That I find really helps to move into the, the actual action of having that conversation and moving towards resolution. The more we practice it, interestingly enough, it actually starts to come a little bit more naturally to us, and it's a little bit easier. I compare myself to what I was 20 years ago when I wouldn't tell my clients what I was actually thinking about their behavior, to now where I can call them out on actions that they're taking that are not aligned with what they say that they want to be doing. So scripting really helped. If we're not sure on the conversation yourself, going to someone else who is better at this and asking them for some potential words that you can use. The other thing I really recommend is the issue register, which I was talking about earlier, this idea of flagging issues that you have or that you're talking about or complaining about, but you're not working to resolve them, and actually putting timelines in your calendar so it actually forces you to work through those conflicts or issues. And that can be used just for you personally, or it can be used for you and your team. So whatever it is that you're finding is coming up. So the first step for the avoidant leader is really to bring things up into consciousness for us. I hope that helps. But it is practice. It's practicing and practicing and practicing, even if it's just finding that one thing every week, being aware that what is one thing that I've avoided doing this week, or one conversation that I avoided having, how can I go back and do that? And because it's never too late to correct it, but the more we become consciously aware of that, us reflecting in that pattern, the easier it is for us to start to shift out of it. And recognizing for any one of these styles, when they're trying to break down those defensive behavioral patterns and rewire their brain, we are rewiring our brain when we do that, it feels uncomfortable. It makes us feel anxious. It makes us feel incompetent. And so it's one of those things of acknowledging that how I'm feeling as I go into this, but still moving ahead and doing it anyway, because that's what registers in the brain. We go have a different experience. We start to build new neural pathways in our brain that will allow us to become more flexible as and not so locked into these defensive patterns like the avoidant leader is. Any other questions? Okay, with that, again, thank you very much for your time and your attention. I hope you found it interesting. If you do think of any questions after the fact, my email is there, my phone number, and as I said, we will be sending around the link to everyone in the next little while so that you do have this for your own future reference as well as to share with others. So again, thanks again, and I hope some of you will have the time and interest to come and learn about the paternalistic leadership style, because that's a really interesting one too. Thanks again.